What up, YouTube? Here with a post-fight video of the Terence Crawford versus Israli Madrimov fight. Now, before I give you out a summary of what happened in the fight, I'm going to tell you the results first. Terence Crawford was able to capture the WBA super welterweight title via unanimous decision, and he was victorious in becoming a 4-division world champion. Mind you, he was a undisputed welterweight champion after coming out victorious versus Errol Spence in his last fight last year, and that was probably his most impressive and dominant performance in his illustrious pro career, not only because of the level of his opponent in Errol Spence, but because of how brilliant he performed versus Errol Spence in his last fight. And this fight versus Madrimov wasn't nowhere as impressive and as dominant and as one-sided as his performance versus Errol Spence. And he became undisputed champion at welterweight, as he was undisputed as super lightweight as well. And he started his professional boxing career at lightweight, where he was successful in becoming the champion at that weight class as well. And then now he ventured out to the super welterweight division, and in his debut fight he got to challenge, well, of course, because of the status that Terence Crawford has and the reputation that he's earned throughout his undefeated professional boxing career, and because of what he's been able to accomplish so far in his professional boxing career, is the reason why he got to challenge for a title immediately, as he decided to move up from welterweight to super welterweight. And I'm quite sure, after assessing his performance versus Israli Madrimov in this fight, I think naturally Terence Crawford, the way his frame is structured, he is probably better off fighting at welterweight instead of at super welterweight, because he seems to be able to be more mobile and more agile when it comes to competing at 147 rather than at 154. And I don't know what it was as far as the controversy goes with Terence Crawford and him having to vacate his titles at welterweight. I know with the IBF it's because he didn't fight the mandatory challenger in Jaron Ennis. And honestly speaking, if Virgil Ortiz didn't move up to super welterweight, and Virgil Ortiz is going to be fighting this Saturday versus Sergey Bout, and it wasn't until Ortiz's last fight that he moved up to super welterweight. Before then, he was a highly ranked contender at welterweight. And now the super welterweight division is more intriguing than the welterweight division is, because now that Errol Spence and Virgil Ortiz has moved up to super welterweight, and then Jermell Charlo, he announced that he's going to be coming back into action, and he was a former undisputed super welterweight champion. And after he fought Canelo Alvarez as super middleweight, and now that he's dropping back down to super welterweight, we got to see how well he's going to be able to perform after moving back down to super welterweight. And because of what he was able to do as super welterweight prior to that fight versus Alvarez, he's still going to be regarded as one of the best, and for sure a high-ranked contender amongst the top of the super welterweights. And Terence Crawford, before initially moving up to super welterweight, was showing interest in wanting a fight versus Jermell Charlo when Charlo was the undisputed super welterweight champion. And let me give y'all the summary of what happened in the fight, because I had gotten carried away talking about how the scene is looking at the super welterweight division. But I personally at this fight scored 116 and 112 in favor of Terence Crawford. And this was the most competitive fight that I've seen Terence Crawford in a long time, because prior to this fight, he had 11 consecutive stoppage victories versus his opponents. And it wasn't his best performance, because we've seen so much better from Terence Crawford. As I said, 11 consecutive TKO wins, and then his last decision win was versus Victor Postol when he was fighting at super lightweight. And that wasn't as competitive as this bout was versus Israli Madrimov. And Madrimov did a good job at fluctuating and being mobile in this fight versus Terence Crawford, which made it hard for Terence Crawford to find his target versus Madrimov. And Madrimov, he's got good fluidity, good upper body movement, good head movement, and good footwork that makes him a hard target to hit. And that was technically challenging for Terence Crawford throughout the whole entire fight. Terence Crawford, his best round was the 12th and final round, and that's when Terence Crawford decided to open up more, and he stepped on the gas pedal, and he turned it up a notch on Israli Madrimov. And Madrimov, for whatever reason, I don't know if he gassed out, and that's maybe because Israli Madrimov, his best rounds were towards the latter part of the rounds, or latter rounds of the fight, I should rather say, because it was the 8th and 9th round, which were the best rounds for Israli Madrimov. And that's when Madrimov turned it up on Terence Crawford, and Madrimov found success in his offense and finding his target for his shots to land. And Terence Crawford was on retreat mode when Madrimov decided to turn it up on him in the 8th and 9th round. The only other rounds that I had scored in favor of Madrimov, other than the 8th and 9th round, were the 4th and 5th round. And the beginning rounds were somewhat close, because I can say this whole entire fight was a chess match. But as y'all know, as avid boxing fans that tap into the sport of boxing with great enthusiasm, know that majority of fights in the beginning opening rounds are fighters trying to figure each other's rhythm and pattern and game plans out. That's how it usually goes in the opening rounds for majority of boxing contests. And that's how it was in the beginning rounds of this bout. And I only gave the opening 3 rounds to Terence Crawford because Crawford was more active than Madrimov. Madrimov seemed to be fighting more cautious and they were both trying to telegraph and download each other's game plans in the opening rounds. But Madrimov was more cautious and was on retreat mode, while Crawford seemed more confident in his rhythmic offensive flow. And both fighters are highly technically sound. And Israli Madrimov, prior to this fight, he's only had 10 professional bouts, but like majority of Eastern European fighters, they have extensive amateur backgrounds. Israli Madrimov had over 350 amateur contests prior to him moving up to the professional ranks. And that seems to be the case with majority of Eastern European and Cuban fighters. They make their careers and reputations out of fighting in the amateur ranks before moving up to the professional ranks. And that's why countries like Cuba and Eastern European countries are so successful when it comes to their amateur programs. And that's why Madrimov, because of his style and his technical abilities, was able to put on a good contest and a good challenge to Terence Crawford. And Madrimov, he was able to find success as well versus Crawford consistently throughout the fight, but it's that Crawford had more moments and Crawford was more consistent and had more effective shots throughout the fight. He was more consistent, and that's what had him winning the fight, not only on my personal scorecard, but as well as all three of the official judges. And Terence Crawford, as I have said, it is his only one fight at 154. And Terence Crawford, of course, because this is a new division that he stepped up at, because he conquered all the titles at welterweight, and he did that versus the best opponent that he's fought thus far in his career in Errol Spence. Prior to that, Terence Crawford's biggest criticism was him fighting non-high quality opponents. And then he fought Sean Porter, who was a high-level opponent, and he put on a heck of a performance versus Sean Porter, and he was the only fighter that Sean Porter fought that was able to stop Sean Porter, and he did the same in fighting Errol Spence and handing Errol Spence his first defeat, and that was via stoppage as well. And because he was able to do that versus high-level fighters like a Sean Porter and Errol Spence, was why we were expecting Terence Crawford. And I was expecting Terence Crawford to stop Israli Madrimov as well. I was predicting that Terence Crawford to win this fight via 7th round TKO, but much credit to Israli Madrimov that he was able to fight Terence Crawford and fight all the way to the distance and fight all 12 rounds, which Terence Crawford wasn't able to do for 8 years. And I know that sounds cliche because it sounded somewhat negative, because it's a positive thing that Terence Crawford didn't go all 12 rounds with his opponents in the last 8 years before fighting Madrimov this past Saturday. And I got to give Madrimov his credit, and that goes to prove Madrimov's technicality and his in-ring ability for him to go toe-to-toe with who is regarded as one of, if not the best pound-for-pound fighter in the sport of boxing right now. And it was a competitive bout. I haven't seen Terence Crawford in such a competitive bout ever. Since I tapped into Terence Crawford, I didn't see Terence Crawford have this close of a bout before. He's always been dominant. Terence Crawford has always been able to finish his opponents in style, and he's always been able to make an example out of all his opponents from all the fights that I've seen Terence Crawford compete in. Now, he's had moments where he's got hit with some effective shots before, but he's always bounced back. And this was a chess match, as I have said, all throughout the whole entire fight. And Terence Crawford didn't get damaged badly where he had to bounce back tremendously like he's showing in prior fights versus guys like Benavidez. And now that Crawford, since moving up to 154, was able to capture the WBA Super Welterweight title this last Saturday, now there's plenty of more opportunities left for Terence Crawford. And the number one ranked contender, according to the WBA, in the Super Welterweight division is Vergil Ortiz, who has been a rumored opponent that's been considered to be next in line to fight Terence Crawford, even when they were both competing at welterweight. And depending on how Ortiz performs versus Bout, we can see Ortiz possibly get in there versus Terence Crawford in their next bout. And Terence Crawford is a free agent when it comes to the promotional side of things. His fight versus Errol Spence was him working with PBC for that mega fight between him and Spence to happen. And then as well as it was for his fight versus Sean Porter, because when he fought Sean Porter, he was under contract with Top Rank, and that was his last fight with Top Rank. And then he built his own promotion, and then he fought Avanasian as a free agent, and then he decided to work with PBC to make that fight happen with Errol Spence. And then now he made his debut fight on the Zone. This was his first fight working with Matchroom and Turk Adish, who is the promoter from Saudi Arabia with Riyadh season. And Madrimov, he's promoted by Top Rank. So this was a crossover promotional bout, a co-venture bout with Top Rank, ESPN, The Zone, and Riyadh season and Matchroom. And it's good to see. It's healthy for the sport to see different promotions coming together to make the best fights happen. And I got to give a shout out and a salute to The Zone, Riyadh season, and Matchroom, because they tend to put on the best bouts and as well as the best cards. And Terence Crawford, even after fighting big draws like Sean Porter and Errol Spence, he's still regarded as a fighter that isn't able to draw. And him fighting Madrimov, who's only had 10 professional bouts, even though he was a champion heading into this fight, Madrimov doesn't have a reputation as a marketable fighter. So if it wasn't for such a stacked card with Isaac Cruz, with Andy Ruiz, Jared Anderson, Okoli, and Gerald Miller, names like that, Rayo Venezuela, who challenged Isaac Cruz and was able to become the new WBA super lightweight champion. Then they upset victory over on Isaac Cruz. And I will give y'all my post-fight thoughts on that fight in a separate video. If it wasn't for such a stacked card on this fight with Terence Crawford versus Israli Madrimov, then would this fight draw a stadium crowd at the BMO Stadium where LA Galaxy plays? And this wasn't at where the Chargers and the Rams play at SoFi Stadium, nor was it at the Dodgers Stadium. It was at the Galaxy Stadium. Not to discredit the promoters that put on such a tremendous event, and the effort is definitely counted for. But if it wasn't for that, can Terence Crawford, and this is with all due respect, will Terence Crawford be able to sell out a Staples Center, Crypto.com arena as it is called now? It's weird to me calling what has been built and what has been known as a Staples Center for so long. It's like LA's Madison Square Garden, and for it to be called Crypto Arena, that's like Madison Square Garden changing its arena name to something else. But anyways, that's besides the point. But if Terence Crawford, if he doesn't fight a marketable opponent, can he sell out a Staples Center fight, or a Madison Square Garden fight, or a MGM Garden T-Mobile Arena fight, versus a fighter that isn't as reputable as him, like a Israel Madrimov, or the current IBF super welterweight champion like a Bakram Mortazaliv, who is also undefeated, and he looked impressive when he was able to stop Cole K to become the IBF super welterweight champion. And now that would be a title unification bout between Crawford and Mortazaliv if they were to meet to unify both the IBF and WBA super welterweight titles. And that would also be a cross-promotional bout. And because Terence Crawford was able to make this fight happen versus Madrimov, with all these different promotions coming together to make this card happen, now will we see that title unification bout next? The most marketable fight that would be the most ideal of a fight next for Terence Crawford would be versus Vergil Ortiz, as it would be for Vergil Ortiz as well. And Ortiz has made a reputation, and he's got good support as well, because when it comes to Mexican fighters, they tend to have a good support system with having avid followers and having a lot of fans supporting Mexican and Mexican-American fighters, and that's the case with Vergil Ortiz as well. And I can say Vergil Ortiz, when it comes to marketability, is perhaps on the same level as Terence Crawford. Hear me out, because it sounds wild because Terence Crawford has done so much throughout his career, and him being considered the #1 best pound-for-pound fighter in all of boxing is the reason why this comparison sounds ridiculous to hardcore boxing fans. But if you look at it from a promotional side of things, when you look at revenue and ticket sales, Vergil Ortiz is able to draw a crowd like Terence Crawford versus the same quality opponents that Ortiz fights versus opponents that are not on the same level as him, but is catapulting Ortiz to become champion one day. And Terence Crawford, he's had more longevity, and I'm not comparing accomplishments, I'm only comparing marketability. And that's why it makes sense for Terence Crawford versus Ortiz to be next if Ortiz is able to finish Boachuk in his next fight coming up this Saturday. And we're expecting Ortiz to be able to knock out Boachuk. Ortiz, now, I know he's had problems when it comes to his health. That's why he took more than a year off. And then he looked impressive in his last fight. He knocked out his opponent, I believe, in the first or second round. But that was his comeback fight to wear off that ring rust. And then him versus Boachuk, we got to assess his performance versus Boachuk. And I did mention that Ortiz is the #1 ranked contender according to the WBA, which is the title currently held by Terence Crawford. And Ortiz, other than Arthur Beterbiev, is the only fighter that fights at a high level that has a 100% knockout ratio. And that's why he possesses a lot of threat to Terence Crawford for that to be a next fight that can possibly be made. And with Terence Crawford having his fight broadcasted on the Zone versus Israli Madrimov, and Vergil Ortiz has been a staple name on the Zone, that's why this fight can possibly happen next and is more likely than a rematch versus Errol Spence. And me personally speaking, I do not want to see a rematch with Terence Crawford and Errol Spence because of how one-sided that fight was. And if Terence Crawford was to work with PBC again, I would want to see Terence Crawford versus Sebastian Fundora. If Fundora is able to get past Errol Spence for their fight that is scheduled for November for both the WBO and WBC super welterweight titles. And that's a all in-house PBC fight with Sebastian Fundora and Errol Spence. And I want to see what Terence Crawford can do versus such a awkward fighter that is, and I say awkward because Sebastian Fundora is uniquely so tall and so lengthy for a fighter that competes at super welterweight, and we haven't seen Terence Crawford fight a fighter that is built like Sebastian Fundora, and his style is also awkward as well because Sebastian Fundora tends to stand in the line of fire and exchange with his opponents more frequently than he has to because he doesn't take advantage of his stature. He doesn't use his reach and height advantage versus his opponents. And we saw that in his fight versus Brian Mendoza, where he got knocked out because he decided to stand in the line of fire and not be rangy versus Brian Mendoza in his fight versus Tim Tszyu. When he fought Tim Tszyu, he was able to come back from his first defeat versus Mendoza. And if you saw the fight with Tim Tszyu and Mendoza, Tim Tszyu was able to make an example out of Mendoza. And we was expecting Tim Tszyu to also get past Sebastian Fundora, but Fundora was able to pull off that upset versus Tim Tszyu in a highly fierce competitive bout. And I wouldn't mind seeing the rematch with Tim Tszyu and Sebastian Fundora because of how thrilling and exciting that bout was. And it was competitive as well. And then Tim Tszyu, who was the WBO champion, and he was trying to capture the WBC super welterweight title as well because it was vacated after Jermell Charlo had to vacate that title. And now that Jermell Charlo's back in the mix as super welterweight, there's so many incredible, intriguing bouts that can be made as super welterweight. And Tim Tszyu, he was supposed to fight Virgil Ortiz, but Tim Tszyu had to pull out of that fight due to, I believe, an injury during his training camp. And that's why Ortiz is fighting Boachuk this Saturday instead of Tim Tszyu, who was his original scheduled opponent. And does that mean Tim Tszyu is not working with PBC anymore? I don't know the promotional side of things when it comes to Tim Tszyu, but Tim Tszyu versus Virgil Ortiz, that's a heck of a bout as well. And Tim Tszyu, who was supposed to fight Jermell Charlo for the undisputed super welterweight title earlier this year and earlier last year as well, but Jermell Charlo was injured, hence why he had to pull out of that fight because he hurt his hands during his training camp in preparation for that fight versus Tszyu. I still wouldn't mind seeing a fight with Jermell Charlo and Tim Tszyu. And Jermell Charlo is promoted by PBC, so I'm quite sure Charlo wants a shot back at capturing his titles at super welterweight, and Jermell Charlo is going to be waiting and keeping a close eye on that fight that's scheduled for November with Errol Spence and Fundora. And whoever wins that fight, expect Jermell Charlo to challenge either one of those fighters for that WBC and WBO super welterweight titles. And that would be an easy fight to make happen because it would be an all PBC bout. And drawing-wise, Errol Spence and Jermell Charlo and Sebastian Fundora are marketable fighters. So it's going to draw a crowd if there's a fight with either of those three guys that is promoted by PBC. And PBC does do a good job at marketing their fighters better than other promotions other than Riot Season and Matchroom, because the UK's boxing scene over there in England seems to be more healthy when it comes to fans than America. Hence why I say, as far as the American side of things, PBC does a better job at promoting American fighters than any other promotions. It's different when it comes to English fighters. Anyways, before I get out of here, I'm going to let y'all know what I was impressed with as far as Terence Crawford's ability. Of course, Terence Crawford's ability to level change and him being a switch hitter. He fought majority of this fight standing at southpaw. I don't recall Terence Crawford switching from southpaw to orthodox, because usually Terence Crawford starts out orthodox, then he'll adjust to standing southpaw when he sees his opponent reading his game plan. That's when he will switch stance. But throughout this fight, and this goes to show how skillful Israli Madrimov is, because Terence Crawford had to consistently fight at a southpaw stance. And I already mentioned Israli Madrimov's ability to move and not be a sitting target for Terence Crawford, and his accuracy and his good punch placements, which Terence Crawford has made a reputation out of. And Terence Crawford is one of the best combination punchers of all time, and he wasn't able to get off combos as frequently as he does versus Madrimov, because Madrimov's defense and his movement. And Terence Crawford, he did a good job, as he always does, at level changing, as I said, going upstairs and downstairs. And as I said, he did the more efficient work, and he caused more oohs and ahs than Israli Madrimov did. And as I said, Madrimov did do a good job at putting Crawford on defense as well. And Crawford is one of the best hybrid fighters of all time. He is what you look for in a all-around, very well-sound boxer. And he was able to display that ability as well, because he is defensively sound as well. And we saw that in the 8th and 9th round, and in the 4th and 5th round as well, when Madrimov decided to step on the gas pedal and put Crawford on the retreat mode. And Crawford does have a tight guard, and he has good movement as well. And that's why Crawford was able to avoid some heavy blows from Madrimov. And when Madrimov would land heavy blows, he was able to gain respect from Crawford. And those are aspects that I was able to assess in this fight. And speaking of this fight, I'm done when it comes to giving y'all my post-fight thoughts for this fight. Subscribe to this channel, and if y'all like this video, y'all could hit the like button, hit the share button. And if y'all want, other than subscribing, if y'all want to subscribe, y'all can subscribe. And if y'all want to support my channel, y'all could click the links in the description to show y'all support for this channel. Anything will be appreciated. And that does it for this video, y'all. I'm out. Be good and peace.